What is the most unbelievable coincidence you ever experienced? We gave my uncle a coffee table book commemorating an NFL team for his birthday. He immediately opened it to the center spread, a panoramic shot of the fans in the stadium. Unbeknownst to any of us beforehand, right in the center of the page was him in the stands. Something like this happened to my dad in a library. It convinced him God is real. Actually, it was me who did it. Hadn't seen or spoken to a friend of mine who lives in a different country for a couple of years. At lunchtime, decided to send him a "Hey, what's been happening?" email. 2 hours later he comes into my work to see me as he was back in town for a few days. He hadn't yet got my email at that point. I wish he replied to your email right before entering your workplace with "I'd rather tell you in person." Your reaction would have been even more priceless. I'm watching you. Our power had been out for about 6 hours. I said watch this to my roommate, flipped the light switch, and the power came back immediately. I'm pretty sure she forgot about it within the week, but I still remember. What if the power was back on and you were just sitting in darkness the whole time? AC wasn't on, neither was the fridge. It's unsettling how quiet it is without power on. This happened to me a while ago. I'm walking through BART, Bay Area Rapid Transit. It's the train station that takes you to and from San Francisco and elsewhere, where an average of 375,000 people pass through daily. I walk up the escalator to my train, and pass by an envelope lying on the ground. At first I didn't think much of it, but I took a couple steps back to pick it up anyways. The next part freaked me out. I looked at the address, and it was addressed to me. I instantly look around to see if it was a practical joke, or if I was about to get assassinated or something. Neither of those were the case. The sender was a family friend, we'll call them the Johnsons. I knew that Mr. Johnson took the BART daily, but I had never personally ran into him. After work, I call him up and ask him about the letter. Turns out, he had about 300 letters with him on BART, and was going to send them out for his daughter's graduation party. What in the world are the chances of him dropping the one letter addressed to me out of the 300, combined with the chances of me being the one out of 375,000 people to pick it up? Pretty wild. For those wondering, I've posted this in a similar thread. I used to fly out to Nevada to play in backgammon tournaments each November. One year, pre-911, I am flying out of BDL on American Airlines. It's chilly in the Northeast that time of year and I had arrived at the airport wearing a heavy jacket. As I am at the AA counter getting a boarding pass and checking luggage, I decide I ought to stuff my jacket into the large suitcase I was checking as it was a balmy 75 degrees in Vegas. So right there on the scale at the end of the AA counter I open my bag, grab my wallet and papers out of the jacket, cram it into the bag, snap it closed, thank the attendant for waiting and head off to the gate. So I get to LV for a 5-day stay, my luggage made it too and I end up having a really good tourney, my best ever actually, by cashing in 3 separate events including second in the open doubles. All told, a great trip. I am returning home about $6,000 richer. Arriving at McCarran for the return flight, I find that my driver's license is nowhere to be found. WTF. Oh well, small price to pay, they let me on the flight and I got a new license when I got back home. Jump forward about 1 year, I am headed to Vegas again for backgammon, again on AA and again find myself at the very same counter getting ready to check luggage and acquire my boarding pass. The guy in front of me is showing his ID and so forth and the gal drops his license which fluttered down and slid right into the slim crack alongside the baggage scale. She has to grab piece of pop art to slide into the crack and coax the license out of the end of the crack. Well, out pops a license which she holds up to read and I see an odd, perplexed expression cross her face as she looks from the man to the license. This is not that man's license. I am watching this all unfold as I am next in line. And I am like, wait a minute, no way. And step forward and say, I believe that is my license and sure as shit, it was. 1 year had elapsed and my license had sat here the whole while until the moment I was there. That is just beyond freaky. A year earlier when stuffing my jacket into my bag, I had laid my loose license, which of course I had out to show the attendant, on top of my bag before I opened it and it had slid down into that very same crack. The attendant was also able to find the other guy's license too but has only spent a few seconds lost down there, mine, a whole year only to resurface in my presence. Cue Twilight Zone music. I posted this a while back, but years back my grandfather had a stroke, and died about a month later. I flipped a coin toss with my brother and ended up the designated driver to help my parents drive the 15-hour trip to Florida. There was a funeral, a burial, and brief goodbyes. Such is life. Afterwards I got a call from some old family friends who lived about 50 miles away inviting me to spend a couple of days with them at their beach house. I spent the night talking with their daughter, and then after about 4 hours of sleep their son, who was the same age I was, showed up and decided I had to get out and spend some quality time with him on the beach. We had been out about 2 hours when he runs into an old girlfriend and some of her friends. We spend the afternoon with them swimming, and then make plans to meet them that night at a beach bar. I end up spending half the night talking with one of the women, just casual stuff. She ends up having to take off to work, so I walk her out to her car around 2 in the morning. I asked her what sort of job she had. She was an occupational therapist, and at that point, lack of sleep, I had no idea what that meant, so I asked her what that involved. I work with people who have had severe injuries, strokes and such. Oh, my grandfather had a stroke. He died a couple of days ago. What was his name? I told her. She gave me an odd look and then hugged me. I was with him when he died. We sat for a while on the beach and she told me about my grandfather's last days, then she had to leave for work. Such is life. I moved to Medford, Oregon from Tucson, Arizona. When I was buying my house, I was on a walkthrough with the previous owners and we got to talking about where they were moving. Turns out, they were moving to Tucson, next door to the house I had just moved from. Not that crazy, but I thought it was kinda cool. Not that crazy? They could have literally been moving to anywhere else in the world, but were moving to where you just moved from, and not just the same town, but next door to where you lived? That's crazy. Met 3 very close friends from back home in the middle of nowhere in Bangkok. I'm from Denmark. It was almost creepy at first. Were they all together? Or were you all by yourselves Final Destination style, 'cause that would be really crazy. Haha, they were together, I was alone. Otherwise I would have turned around and run as fast as possible. Smile. I was getting close to my due date and sent in my resignation to my manager in HR. Losing my salary was going to put us in a financial mess. The very minute I sent the email, my husband received one from a company he'd interviewed with 6 months prior, with a job offer out of the blue. The kicker is that his new salary was the exact amount that our 2 jobs added up to. When I was in 6th grade English class, in America, I asked my teacher if I could borrow a ruler. If we finished our assignment for the day, we were able to move on to other classes. When she handed the ruler to me, I flipped it over so see my dad's name etched on the back, and underneath it was my sister's name. I told the teacher that the ruler had their name on it, and that I was going to take it home. My sister had apparently lost the ruler when she was in the same class 8 years prior. It was my dad's ruler when he was in middle school in the 1950s. My dad worked in politics in DC. When I was about 6, our family rented out our basement to a longtime coworker/friend of his. She was just out of college, I think she had been an intern, so we gave her a fair rental price for what was a pretty nice apartment somewhat close to Capitol Hill in DC. She lived there for 2 years or so, then moved out to better digs. She still was around though, both her and my dad being involved in the same political issues and stuff. A couple of years later my dad is at a family wedding, and he sees her there. Turns out they were second cousins by marriage. It took like 5 years to figure this out. Must have made the affair weird after that. When I was 5 and living in Ohio, I watched a boy just a few years older than me mow a lawn near my best friend's house. I remember thinking he was cute, and very young to be mowing. My friend didn't know who he was because an old lady lived in the house. Fast forward 15 years and I was living in Indiana and working with a guy that I kind of liked. I was driving back to Ohio one weekend to do my laundry at my parents' house, and noticed that he is driving next to me on the highway. Turns out that his parents live less than 3 miles from my parents' house and he was going home to visit his folks as well. Come to find out, he grew up in Arizona and his grandma lived in a small Ohio town. He visited. One summer, mowed her lawn, I watched. His parents moved to a small Ohio town near the grandma years later, and my parents bought a house near his parents. He and I both moved to Indiana, where we met at a job. Stranger yet, we almost met 6 months before we started working together. I was in marketing and had an event at a bar. He ran the kitchen at the bar and would have met me that night. Instead, the police came and shut the bar down that very day due to a bankruptcy that we didn't know was coming. We have been married for 21 years. TL, Dr. True Love is meant to be. I was borrowing my mom's car for the week and one afternoon I get home and notice the brake lights won't turn on after the car is turned off. I didn't want the battery to go flat, so I disconnected it and planned to reconnect it the next morning. That night someone tried to steal it by taking apart the steering column and jamming a screwdriver into the ignition. Looks like he knew what he was doing and he'd probably have got away with it. But because the battery was disconnected and he didn't know about it, the car was there the next morning. I don't believe this story actually happened. Edit. Just bumped into /U/H3NR7's kindergarten teacher. She told me the story. He's telling the truth. At the end of the workday, I had a really bad feeling about driving home. I was afraid that I was going to get hurt somehow, and I didn't want to leave. I sat at my desk for 5 minutes, trying to convince myself that it was just a silly feeling. I mean, I can't possibly stay in the office all night, right? So I get into my car and drive home. At the intersection near my house there's 3 cars that have collided moments before. One driver got out of his car slowly, I could see blood streaming down his face. In the end, nobody was seriously injured. But I always wondered what would have happened if I left work on time that day. When my sister was going to preschool in 1985, she was given a set of personalized pencils. Last year we were at the same church that hosted the preschool for a family member's graduation. We were handed a pencil to fill out some form, and on the side of it was my sister's name. It was one of her pencils from 30 years ago. Was working in a restaurant at Point A for half a year. One day a table looked at me strangely and said, "You look familiar. Did you work at B Cafe?" "Nope," I answered and didn't pay much attention to this. Until a few months later I found myself working at B Cafe. Somewhere along the 2 years I spent at B Cafe I had another similar conversation. "Hey, did you happen to work at C Restaurant? You look just like our waitress there." Guess where my next workplace was? Yup, that's right. TLDR, time travel I guess. I found an AskReddit about Disney World. I copied the link and tried to text it to myself, but unknowingly got one digit wrong. The number belonged to a guy who works for Disney World and he was scared because a random number knew where he worked. Was walking on a sidewalk with my family on a trip to Dallas, Texas. Suddenly my mom starts running forward and embraces a woman I have never seen. Turned out to be an old friend of my mom she hadn't seen in like 20 years, who was also on a trip to Dallas with her family and just happened to be walking down the same side of the same street. I like to believe that you both proceeded to poop at the same time as well. I had just taken my son on a walk in his stroller and was getting back to the car when I noticed one of his shoes was missing. There was no way I was going to walk the length of the path again to find it, so I said, "Oh well, maybe I'll luck out and find it the next time I walk here." That weekend my husband and I were walking the same route. I was looking along the side for the shoe, when a lady bikes up and asks us if we were missing a shoe. There was the sandal. She had picked it up and decided to look for its owner at the same time we happened to be walking. 5 days later, I was watching the Disney Channel original movie called Luck of the Irish about a teenager who finds out he's actually a leprechaun, basically the plot from Teen Wolf if you switch it from a werewolf to a midget, and the character always finds $20 bills on the ground, one of the signs that you are a leprechaun. Lots of inexplicable luck/fortune. So I went out for my bike ride a little later that afternoon and lo and behold I found a $20 bill. My 4th grade self was king ecstatic. Never became a leprechaun though. The evil leprechaun in that movie is Lassie from Psych. Every time I watch that show I expect him to start using an Irish accent. Was playing The Last of Us multiplayer with this cool couple. Knew they were Canadian but didn't know from where. We played together for months before realizing we lived like 5 blocks from each other. A few days after they invite their other friend who also lives in our city to a match and it takes me a whopping 3 hours before I realize I know him. Small world, especially considering I usually play with Brazilians, Japanese, Mexicans. The servers are not local at all. Also when I was in middle school, my friends or I were being dickbags. We tore off one of those ads off a telephone pole and called the number and basically just dickhead around with some poor old Asian couple that owned a dry cleaners. We weren't being malicious at all, just wasting their time. Finally a younger guy picks up the phone and I start saying some dumb shit. "So tot showy Augstens? I almost had a coronary at 13. How did you know my name?" He's like, "It's Richard. I'm in your math class. Please stop calling us." Very awkward. Finally my time to shine. So I was in class, and one of my friends is giving me his number. I text the number just to make sure it's the right one. He doesn't get the text. I overhear a girl behind me talking about a random text from a random number. I text him again. Again I hear the girls talk. I ask her if somebody texted her what I'd texted my friend. Turns out I put the last 2 digits in wrong, and it happened to be the number of a girl behind me. She was hot AF too. The odds blessed me that day. I've always wanted to calculate the chances of that happening. Perhaps some /r/they did the math people can help me. A delayed deja vu. I was at school when I had the strange urge to tell a friend of mine that one of the boys, Paolo, would, specifically on 11:05 a.m., ask the teacher to go to the bathroom. It was around 10:35 a.m., so we got back to solve the questions on our notebooks. When my friend realized it was already 11:05 a.m. he said it didn't work. And I just laughed and agreed, then got back to solve the questions. All of a sudden, Paolo asked the teacher if he could go to the bathroom and I looked on my watch, feeling a real deja vu this time. It was indeed 11:05 a.m. Deja vu is so weird. Every time I have it, I remember the feeling of remembering more than anything else. Thanks for listening to another episode of Reddit X. Subscribe and activate the notification bell so you won't miss any stories. Feel free to share your own stories below in the comments. Have a good day.